Let me tell you a story that will make you question everything you think you know about trust. My name's Ethan, and up until last month, I thought I had a solid life, 45 years old, a steady job as an accountant, married to Rachel for 15 years, and stepdad to her daughter, Emily. At least, I thought I was her stepdad. That belief came crashing down in the most unexpected way, leaving me feeling like I'd stepped into someone else's nightmare. It all started innocently enough, just a quiet afternoon spent clearing out the attic, tackling the forgotten piles of old junk we'd been ignoring for years. Rachel had always been strangely protective of her memory boxes, calling them treasures from her youth. But when my hand landed on one particularly dusty suitcase, her tone changed, and with it, my entire reality. "What are you doing? Leave that alone." "It's not important," she snapped, her voice sharp and defensive. That sudden shift in her tone sent warning bells ringing in my head. As an accountant, I've got a knack for spotting when things don't add up. Later that evening, when Rachel left for what she claimed was a work event, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. So, I went back up to the attic. I couldn't stop myself. I dragged the suitcase down into the living room, set it on the coffee table, took a deep breath, and flipped it open. What I found inside hit me like a punch to the gut. There were letters, photographs, hotel receipts, and even printed out text messages, evidence spanning years, maybe even decades. It was a stash of lies, each piece laying out in painful clarity an affair between Rachel and a man named David. The worst part? This had started long before Rachel and I had ever exchanged vows. It didn't take me long to piece together the ugly truth. This wasn't some fleeting romance or a one-time mistake. David wasn't just another man, he was Emily's biological father. I sat there, stunned, staring at a photo of the two of them grinning on a beach, lounging in a cabana. The date stamped in the corner showed it had been taken just a month before Rachel and I got married. The realization hit me like a runaway freight train. This wasn't just infidelity. My entire marriage had been built on deception. I was still sitting there, the suitcase wide open on the table, when Emily walked in. She froze in the doorway, her face going pale as her eyes flickered to the contents on display. That's when it hit me, she knew. She'd known all along. "Want to explain this?" I asked, my voice unsteady but firm. She didn't reply, just stood there staring at the floor like a kid who'd been caught red-handed. After what felt like forever, she finally mumbled, "It's not what you think." I let out a bitter laugh. "It's exactly what I think. And you've been covering for her, haven't you?" She stuttered something about trying to protect me, about not wanting to hurt me, but her words barely registered. My mind was already racing. This wasn't just a betrayal, it was a betrayal stacked on betrayal. The people I trusted most had been hiding the truth from me. I'd spent 15 years raising Emily, being there for her through scraped knees, hard math problems, and teenage heartbreaks. And now I was finding out she wasn't mine in any way. I haven't confronted Rachel yet, not fully, at least. I'm taking my time, gathering every shred of evidence, documenting it all with the precision I've honed over years of tracking down fraud. If Rachel thought she could keep playing games, she couldn't have picked a worse opponent. I'll make sure this betrayal costs her everything. This is far from over. I've only started pulling apart the tangled mess she's created. There's much more to come. Stay tuned. That night, I didn't get a wink of sleep. I sat in my office, sorting through every piece of evidence I'd pulled from that suitcase, creating files, and labeling each letter, photo, and receipt with dates and details. With each item I handled, my anger grew. This wasn't a spur-of-the-moment mistake. This was a premeditated betrayal that had been going on for more than 20 years. By the time Rachel came back home from her so-called work event, I was ready for her. She walked in like it was any other night, her heels clicking against the tile floor as she dropped her purse on the counter. I was standing there in the living room, the suitcase still sitting on the coffee table where I'd left it. When she saw it, she froze, the color draining from her face. "What's this, Rachel?" I asked, keeping my tone steady, though it was ice cold. She froze for a second, then scrambled to regain her footing. "Why are you going through my things? That's private." "Private?" I repeated, the word dripping with sarcasm. "That's your defense?" I picked up one of the letters and held it in front of her face. "Does David know how much you value your private memories? Or is he too busy writing you love letters while I foot the bill for this house?" Her expression shifted rapidly, first panic, then defiance. "Ethan, it's not what you think." "Enough. Just stop," I snapped, louder than I'd meant to. "I've gone through it all. I know about David. I know about the trips, the gifts, the hotels. I know about Emily. Do you have any idea what it's like to realize your entire marriage has been a lie?" She tried stepping closer to me, reaching out, but I instinctively pulled back. "Don't touch me," I said, my voice sharp and unyielding. "Not after this." "Let me explain," she pleaded, her voice trembling and cracking. "It's complicated." "Oh, it's not complicated," I shot back. "You've been screwing David since before we even got married. And Emily, she's not even mine, is she? You let me love her, raise her, sacrifice for her, and you didn't say a damn thing." Her lips quivered like she might deny it, but she didn't. Instead, she doubled down. "I didn't want to hurt you, Ethan. You've been an amazing father to Emily. She loves you." "Stop right there," I interrupted, my voice biting. "Don't you dare try to dress this up as some kind of kindness. You've been lying to me for 15 years. And Emily? She's been lying too. She knew, didn't she?" Rachel didn't answer, but the silence spoke louder than words. That was all the confirmation I needed. I took a step back, my stomach churning with disgust. You let me pour my time, my money, and my love into a family that wasn't even mine to begin with. You've made a fool out of me, Rachel. But you're not getting away with it. "What do you mean?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper, trembling with fear. "You'll find out soon enough," I said, my tone cold and flat. "But let me make one thing clear, I'm done. You don't deserve me, and I'm not going to keep pretending this marriage is anything but a sham. I've been an accountant my whole life, Rachel. You know what I'm best at? Settling accounts. And yours is about to come due." With that, I turned on my heel and walked out of the room. She stood there, frozen and speechless. For the first time in years, I felt like I was in control again. And I wasn't about to let go of that feeling. This was just the beginning. The next morning, Emily. The following morning, I didn't bother waiting for Emily to wake up. I stormed into her room at the crack of dawn. She was buried under a heap of blankets, headphones in, her phone lighting up her hands. When she noticed me standing in the doorway, she bolted upright, startled. "Get up," I said, my tone as cold as ice. "We're having a conversation. Now." Without waiting for her to reply, I turned and walked downstairs. A few minutes later, she shuffled into the kitchen, still in her pajamas, her hair a mess. She looked half annoyed and half nervous, trying to gauge what this was all about. "What's going on?" she asked, her tone defensive. I didn't waste a second. I reached for one of the photos and slid it across the table, a snapshot of Rachel and David with Emily as a toddler, her tiny arms wrapped around David's neck. Emily's eyes widened as she glanced at the image, but she quickly tried to cover it up with a blank expression. "Care to explain this?" I asked, leaning forward, my voice low and deliberate. "Where did you get that?" Emily asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "I found the suitcase," I replied, leaning forward, my eyes fixed on hers. "I know everything, Emily. About your mom, about David, and about the fact that he's your biological father. She swallowed hard, her face stiffening, but she didn't say a word. Don't try to play innocent, I pressed, my voice sharper now. You've known for years, haven't you? You've been helping her keep this from me, lying to me, letting me stay in the dark. Do you have any idea how it feels to find out the girl I thought I was raising as my own has been part of this betrayal? Her lips trembled, but she crossed her arms and squared her shoulders, clearly trying to act tougher than she felt. I didn't ask for this, she muttered, her voice low and defensive. No, I shot back, but you made the choice to keep it going. Why, Emily? Why didn't you tell me the truth? Finally, she broke. Tears spilled down her cheeks as she blurted out, because I didn't want to hurt you, okay? Mom told me not to say anything. She said you wouldn't understand, that it would ruin everything. I didn't want to lose you. Her words hit me hard, but they didn't excuse what she'd done. You already lost me, Emily, I said coldly. The moment you decided I didn't deserve the truth. You and your mother didn't just hurt me, you destroyed everything we built as a family. And for what? To protect some twisted version of reality where lies don't matter? I didn't know what else to do, she sobbed, her voice cracking. I was scared. And Mom, she made it seem like it was the right thing to do. Don't put all the blame on her, I snapped, my tone unwavering. You're old enough to know the difference between right and wrong. And you chose wrong, again and again. At that, Emily crumpled, burying her face in her hands. Part of me wanted to reach out, to comfort her like I had so many times before. But I couldn't, not after everything. You need to hear this, I said, my voice steady but firm. For 15 years, I've loved you like my own daughter. I've given you everything, my time, my money, my support, and this is how you repay me? By lying to my face? By letting me play the stand-in while your real dad shows up for the good times? Her head shot up, her eyes red and swollen. David's not my dad, she said bitterly. Not really. He's never been there for me. You're the one who's been there. You're my dad, not him. I shook my head, my heart aching in ways I couldn't describe. No, Emily. I was your dad. But you and your mom took that away from me. You can't have it both ways. I didn't say another word. I turned and walked out of the kitchen, leaving her sitting there, her face buried in her hands. I wasn't ready to forgive her, not yet, and maybe not ever. At that moment, all I felt was a chilling sense of detachment, like I was watching someone else's life fall apart. Taking the next step. That afternoon, I made up my mind. I wasn't going to let Rachel or Emily keep me trapped in this mess any longer. I was done being the fool, done giving everything I had and getting nothing but lies in return. It was time to move forward, and that started with making sure Rachel didn't walk away unscathed. The next day, I scheduled another meeting with Lucas, my lawyer. I came prepared with a stack of meticulously organized documents, receipts for hotel stays and dinners that Rachel and David had enjoyed on my dime, proof of joint accounts she drained to fund their secret trips, and even credit card statements with timestamps that matched the evidence I'd found in the suitcase. If Rachel thought she could fight me in court, she was in for a rude awakening. Lucas flipped through the files, nodding in approval. This is thorough, he said, glancing up at me. If she tries to push back, we've got more than enough to make her regret it. That's the idea, I replied, my voice firm. She's not walking away from this clean. Lucas was impressed as he scanned through the records I'd handed him. You've really done your homework, Ethan, he said, flipping through page after page. With this much evidence, you've got a solid case for financial misconduct. Add in the infidelity and Rachel's deception about Emily's paternity, and you're in a very strong position. That's the plan, I replied, my tone flat and resolute. I'm not walking away from this with nothing. And you won't, Lucas assured me. But I have to ask, what's your plan for Emily? Legally, you're not required to support her since she's not your biological daughter, especially given everything Rachel's kept from you. I hesitated. Emily wasn't just some random kid, I'd been there for her every step of the way. I'd taught her how to ride a bike, patched up her scraped knees, and helped her navigate the mess of teenage heartbreaks. But now, knowing she'd lied to me like her mother had, it was hard to reconcile the love I felt with the betrayal still fresh in my mind. I don't know yet, I admitted after a long pause. I need time to figure that part out. Right now, my focus is on making sure Rachel doesn't get more than she deserves, and that's not much. Lucas nodded. That's fair. Let's prioritize the divorce for now. We'll deal with Emily when the time comes. Serving the papers. A week later, Rachel was served with the divorce papers. I had made sure the timing was deliberate, Friday evening, right before the weekend, so she'd have plenty of time to sit with it. Emily was staying overnight at a friend's house, which meant Rachel would be alone when the reality hit her. That evening, I swung by the house to pick up some of my things. As I walked in, I found Rachel sitting at the dining room table, the divorce papers spread out in front of her. Her face was pale, her eyes rimmed with redness, like she'd been crying for hours. She looked up at me, and for a fleeting moment, I thought she might try to beg for forgiveness. Instead, her expression hardened. "You're really doing this?" she asked, her voice shaking. "Yes," I said, my tone steady. "You made your choices, Rachel. Now you have to live with them." She laughed bitterly, her voice dripping with sarcasm. "You act like you're perfect in all of this. What about you, Ethan? You've never made mistakes? Maybe if you had been." "Enough," I interrupted, my voice as sharp as a knife. "Don't you dare try to put this on me. I wasn't the one sneaking around for years. I wasn't the one lying for 15 years. This is all on you, Rachel. Every single bit of it." Her mouth opened like she wanted to argue, but I didn't give her the chance. "You used me, Rachel," I said, my voice low and cold. "You lied to me. You made me a fool. And now, you're going to face the consequences. You're not getting the house. You're not getting spousal support. And Emily? Fletcher can finally step up and be her dad. I'm done." Rachel's face crumpled as she broke into tears. "She loves you, Ethan. She needs you," she sobbed. "She needed me when she was a little girl," I said, my voice unwavering. "Now? She needs to learn that actions have consequences. And so do you." Rachel buried her face in her hands, her body shaking as she cried. I felt a flicker of guilt, but I pushed it aside. She didn't deserve my sympathy, not after what she'd done. "You'll be hearing from my lawyer," I said, already turning toward the door. "This conversation is over." Targeting David. With Rachel's fate sealed, I turned my attention to David. There was no way I was letting him escape unscathed. I'd already sent an anonymous tip to his employer, detailing how he'd been misusing company funds to bankroll his affair with Rachel. It hadn't taken long for the fallout to begin, his suspension came swiftly. But that was just the beginning. David's professional life was crumbling, and now it was time to make sure his personal life followed suit. I wasn't doing this out of spite, not entirely, anyway. It was about accountability. People like him didn't get to walk away without paying the price for what they'd done. I tracked down David's wife, Lauren. I'd met her once, years ago, at a charity event, a poised, elegant woman who clearly had no idea what kind of man she'd married. She deserved the truth. When she opened the door, her expression shifted from surprise to concern. "Ethan? What are you doing here?" "Sorry to show up like this," I said, holding up a manila folder, "but there's something you need to see. It's about David." She hesitated, her eyes narrowing, but after a moment, she stepped aside and let me in. We sat down in her spotless living room, every detail perfectly curated. I opened the folder and laid out the evidence: photos, letters, receipts. As she went through each piece, her hands began to tremble. "How long?" she asked, her voice barely audible. "Over 20 years, I said bluntly. He's been having an affair with my wife. I only just found out." Her face tightened, her initial shock giving way to a cold, steely resolve. "Thank you for telling me," she said, her voice calm but firm. "I'll take care of this." I left her house knowing I'd just set David's carefully constructed life on fire. By the end of the week, the fallout was everywhere. David had lost his job, been kicked out of his home, and was the center of town gossip. Watching his meticulously crafted image collapse gave me a grim sense of satisfaction. Justice had been served. Moving forward, with Rachel served and David's world in shambles, I felt something I hadn't experienced in weeks: clarity. My old life was gone, but that didn't mean I had to let the bitterness define me. If anything, this was an opportunity, a chance to rebuild, not just for myself but for something bigger, something meaningful. I started by taking control of what I could. The house, once a symbol of the life I thought I had, went up for sale. I kept only what truly mattered: a few family heirlooms, my books, and some practical furniture. The rest, the memories, the lies, could stay with Rachel. I moved into a small downtown apartment. It wasn't much, but it was mine, and for the first time in years, I wasn't living under anyone else's expectations. I began reaching out to old friends and colleagues, people I'd drifted away from while trying to play the perfect husband and stepdad. Slowly but surely, I started to rediscover who I was before everything fell apart. Mediation Day. When the day of the divorce mediation arrived, Rachel and I found ourselves sitting across from each other in a stark, clinical conference room. She looked like a shell of the woman I'd married, pale, tired, and visibly defeated. Her lawyer attempted to argue for spousal support and a generous share of our marital assets, but Lucas was prepared. "You're fortunate Mr. Ethan is even willing to negotiate," Lucas said, his tone professional but firm. Given the evidence of financial misconduct and infidelity, the court would almost certainly rule heavily in his favor. Rachel shot me a venomous glare, her eyes glassy with unshed tears. "You can't just erase 15 years, Ethan." "I'm not erasing anything," I replied calmly. "You did that the moment you decided to build our life on lies." In the end, she got what was fair, but not a penny more. I kept the house, waived spousal support, and agreed to set aside a modest fund for Emily's college. If she needed anything else, David could take care of it. When Rachel finally signed the papers, her hands shook. For a moment, I thought she might say something, a last-ditch attempt to fix what couldn't be repaired. But she stayed silent. She stood up, gave me one last look, and walked out of the room without a word. Complicated ties. As much as I wanted to sever every connection with Rachel and David, things with Emily weren't so simple. She was still a kid, stuck in the middle of a mess she hadn't created but had played a part in sustaining. Part of me wanted to let her face the consequences with David, but another part, the part of me that had raised her, couldn't turn away completely. I began meeting her halfway. Conversations were stilted at first, awkward, defensive, filled with unspoken tension, but they slowly started to improve. She was trying in her own way, and while it didn't erase the pain of her betrayal, it gave me a small thread of hope. After all, she was still the girl I'd taught to ride a bike, comforted during thunderstorms, and helped navigate the chaos of teenage heartbreak. Letting her go completely wasn't something I could do, not yet, at least. We began meeting for lunch once a week, choosing a neutral spot where we could talk without the weight of everything hanging over us. At first, the conversations were strained, awkward exchanges filled with defensiveness on her part and guarded responses on mine. Emily was angry, full of excuses, and reluctant to open up. But as the weeks passed, the walls between us started to crumble. One afternoon, as we sat in a greasy diner, splitting a plate of fries, she finally said the words I'd been waiting to hear. "I'm sorry, Ethan," she said softly, her eyes fixed on the table. "For lying. For letting Mom drag me into it. I should have told you the truth." I nodded, keeping my tone calm and steady. "I know you're sorry, Emily. But rebuilding trust isn't something that happens overnight. You've got a lot of work to do." She finally lifted her gaze to meet mine, her eyes brimming with tears. "Do you still love me? Even after all of this?" It was a question I'd been avoiding, not because I didn't know the answer, but because admitting it felt like giving in to the pain all over again. Despite the betrayal, despite everything, she was still the little girl I'd taught to ride a bike, the one who'd fallen asleep on my shoulder during scary thunderstorms. My love for her hadn't disappeared, it had just been buried beneath all the hurt and anger. "I'll always love you, Emily," I said at last. "But love doesn't erase consequences. You need to understand that." She nodded, tears streaking down her cheeks as she wiped her face with her sleeve. "I'll do better. I promise." Finding purpose. With the dust starting to settle, I found myself thinking about what came next. My career had always been stable, but I wanted something more. I didn't want this pain to define me, I wanted it to mean something. Late one night, as I sat alone in my apartment, the beginnings of an idea started to take shape. I began researching organizations that helped men who'd been victims of infidelity or paternity fraud. What I found was staggering. Story after story mirrored my own, men who had poured their time, love, and resources into families, only to discover they'd been deceived. I realized I wasn't alone, and that realization sparked something inside me, a sense of purpose. By the end of the month, I'd filed the paperwork to launch a foundation, Truth and Trust. Its mission was clear: to support men dealing with similar betrayals by providing legal aid, counseling, and a community where they could find the strength to rebuild their lives. This wasn't just about seeking justice, it was about equipping people with the tools they needed to move forward. Closing one chapter. The day my divorce was finalized, I stood on the courthouse steps with the papers in my hand. The weight I'd carried for months finally lifted. The man who had walked into this mess wasn't the same man standing there now. I was stronger, more focused, and ready to move forward. That evening, I called Emily. She sounded hesitant when she answered, unsure of where we stood. I didn't sugarcoat things, but I told her the truth. "I'm still your dad, Emily," I said. "In the ways that matter. It's going to take time to heal, but if you're willing to try, so am I." Her voice cracked as she replied, "I am. Thank you." As for Rachel and David, they became little more than footnotes in my life. Rachel stayed in town, though her once flawless reputation was in shambles. David slunk away, leaving behind a ruined career and a marriage in tatters. Neither of them would ever have a place in my story again. A new beginning. Months later, I found myself standing on the stage of a small community center, addressing a room full of men who'd come to the first Truth and Trust meeting. Some were angry, others looked hollow, but they all had one thing in common: a desire to rebuild. "Betrayal doesn't define us," I said, looking out at them. "What does is how we choose to move forward. We've been broken, but that doesn't mean we're done. Together, we'll find a way to rebuild, stronger than before." The room erupted in applause, but what stayed with me was the quiet pride I felt. My life hadn't gone the way I'd planned, but I wasn't just surviving anymore, I was building something meaningful, not just for myself, but for others too. "Betrayal doesn't define us," I said, scanning the faces in the crowd. "What does is what we choose to do next. We can let the lies tear us apart, or we can use them as a foundation to build something stronger. Something real." The room broke into applause, and for the first time in what felt like forever, I felt something unfamiliar yet welcome: hope. My life hadn't gone the way I'd imagined, but it wasn't over. In fact, it was just beginning. Rebuilding with purpose. The months that followed were transformative in ways I never could have predicted. Truth and trust took off faster than I'd ever imagined. Men from all over began reaching out, not just to share their stories but to thank me for creating a space where they felt seen and supported. A place where their pain was acknowledged without judgment. What started as a channel for my own anger turned into a lifeline for so many others, and, in turn, for me. Days were spent managing the foundation, organizing events, coordinating resources, and speaking with the men who needed help. Evenings, though, were mine. I rediscovered the parts of myself I'd long forgotten, the man I was before I tried so hard to be everything for everyone else. I took up hobbies I'd left behind, reading novels for fun, hiking trails just to clear my head, and even tinkering in woodworking projects that kept my hands busy and my mind calm. For the first time in years, my time was truly mine. I still thought about Rachel and David occasionally, though the fiery anger that used to consume me had simmered down into something colder: indifference. Word filtered back to me that Rachel was struggling to keep up her old facade. As for David, he seemed to have vanished. Lauren had filed for divorce not long after our conversation, and their home went on the market shortly after that. But those thoughts came and went without much weight. My focus was no longer on what had been, it was on what lay ahead. Rebuilding with Emily. Emily was one of the few threads from my old life I wasn't ready to let go of. Rebuilding our relationship was slow, often painful. Trust isn't something you snap back into place, and there were days when the betrayal still felt raw. But I could see she was trying. She made the effort to show up for our lunches, to be honest with me, even to ask questions about my life, the kind of questions she'd never thought to ask before. It was a start. Then one evening, she called me out of the blue. "Ethan?" Her voice wavered, uncertain. "Yeah, Emily. What's on your mind?" She hesitated, and I could almost hear her gathering her courage. "I wanted to say thank you. For not giving up on me." Her words hit me like a gentle weight, unexpected but deeply felt. I let the silence stretch, choosing my reply carefully. "You're my kid, Emily. You've got a lot to make up for, but I'm not going anywhere." I could hear her sniffle, her voice cracking as she replied, "I promise I won't let you down again." That moment was a turning point for us. Slowly but surely, our relationship shifted away from what we'd lost and toward what we were building. She began to open up, sharing her anger at Rachel, her confusion about David, and the guilt she carried over everything that had happened. Sometimes, I offered advice. Other times, I just listened. Either way, we were moving forward. A letter that changed everything. One night, about a year after the divorce was finalized, I stood in the kitchen of my apartment, stirring a pot of chili on the stove. My phone buzzed with a notification. It was an email from Emily. Curious, I opened it, expecting something casual. Instead, I found a letter, long and heartfelt. It wasn't another apology but something deeper. She reflected on everything we'd been through, how the fallout had forced her to grow, and how much she wanted to be someone I could be proud of. She ended by saying how grateful she was that I hadn't walked away when it would have been so easy to do so. By the time I finished reading, I realized tears were streaming down my face, not from sadness but from something closer to relief. She was growing, learning, and carving her own path forward. It wasn't perfect, life never is, but it was progress. And for me, that was enough. Truth and trust became something far bigger than I ever imagined. What began as a small support group turned into a national movement. Articles were written about us, interview requests poured in, and donations followed. It wasn't long before I hired a small team to help manage the growing workload. Together, we expanded the foundation's reach, helping men across the country find hope in the midst of heartbreak. One day, a letter arrived from a man named James. He'd gone through something eerily similar, betrayed by his wife and cut off from a child he'd spent years believing was his own. His words weren't just a thank you, they were a testament to the power of what we were building. He wrote about how truth and trust had given him strength, a lifeline he hadn't known he needed, and the courage to begin healing. That letter stuck with me. It reminded me that this wasn't just about me anymore. It was about every man who'd been left to pick up the shattered pieces of a life built on lies. It gave me the drive to keep going, no matter how challenging the work became. Finding peace. 2 years after the divorce, I stood on the balcony of my new home. It wasn't grand or luxurious, but it was perfect for me, a cozy place on the edge of a forest, where the world felt quiet and the air was always crisp. That evening, the sky was awash with the colors of sunset, shades of orange and purple melting into one another. I took a deep breath, letting the coolness fill my lungs. Life still wasn't perfect. There were moments when doubt crept in, when a memory or a thought reminded me of everything I'd lost. Sometimes, anger flashed unexpectedly, but it was fleeting. Those moments no longer defined me. Instead, they became reminders of how far I'd come. I'd built something new out of the ruins, a life rooted in purpose, stronger than the one I thought I'd had before. As the sun dipped below the horizon, my phone buzzed. It was a text from Emily. "Dinner tomorrow?" My treat. A smile spread across my face as I typed back a quick response. Wouldn't miss it. For the first time in years, I wasn't just getting by, I was living. Lessons from the past. As time went on, I found myself reflecting more often on how far I'd come. Occasionally, the past would creep back in, snapshots of moments I'd once thought were genuine, flashes of a life that had felt so solid before it crumbled. But instead of anger, those memories started to feel more like lessons. The betrayal had stripped me bare, but it had also given me the chance to rebuild myself from the ground up, stronger and more focused than ever. One afternoon, as I was unpacking an old box, I stumbled across a framed photo of Emily and me at her middle school graduation. She was grinning ear to ear, her cap slightly askew, and my arm was wrapped around her shoulders. Looking at that picture, I felt a pang, not of regret, but of gratitude. It was a reminder that, despite the lies, I'd done something good. Those years weren't wasted, even if the foundation they were built on was flawed. I placed the photo on a shelf in my living room. It wasn't forgiveness, not yet, but it was a step toward letting go of the pain. Building a new relationship. Emily continued to surprise me. She had taken my words to heart, working every day to repair what had been broken. She called me for advice, not because she had to, but because she genuinely wanted to hear my perspective. The apologies, which once came frequently, started to fade, not because she wasn't sorry, but because she understood that actions carried more weight than words. She was proving herself, and I couldn't help but feel proud. One evening, she invited me over for dinner at her college apartment. The place was modest, shared with 2 roommates, but it was clear she had put in effort to make it special. She'd even cooked a proper meal. As we sat down at the small table, she looked at me with a seriousness I hadn't seen in her before. "Ethan," Emily began, her voice soft but steady. "I know I've said this before, but, thank you. For staying. For giving me another chance." I put down my fork, meeting her gaze. "You've earned it, Emily. And I'll always be here for you. Just, don't give me a reason to doubt you again." She nodded, her expression solemn, a tear slipping down her cheek. "I won't. I promise." New connections. My work with truth and trust brought me into contact with people I never would have met otherwise. One of them was Anna, a family therapist who volunteered to lead workshops for the men in our program. She was sharp, empathetic, and had a knack for cutting through even the toughest exteriors to reach the heart of the issue. At first, our relationship stayed strictly professional. We collaborated on resources for the foundation, brainstorming over coffee and exchanging long email chains. But over time, our conversations grew more personal. Anna shared her own story, a failed marriage and a career shaped by resilience. I found myself opening up to her in ways I hadn't allowed myself to do with anyone else in years. One evening, after a particularly long day at a Truth and Trust event, we were packing up when she turned to me. "What you've built here is incredible," she said, her voice warm and sincere. "It's rare to see someone turn their pain into something so meaningful." I smiled, feeling a warmth I hadn't experienced in a long time. "It's not just me," I replied. "People like you make it all possible." For the first time in years, I felt the stirrings of something I thought I'd lost, a sense of hope, not just for the future, but for the possibility of letting someone new into my life. Letting go. One day, while cleaning out old emails, I came across a message from Rachel. It was from the early years of our marriage, a simple note thanking me for being patient with Emily during a tough time. Reading it felt like opening a time capsule. It was a glimpse of a version of Rachel I'd once loved, before everything unraveled. I didn't reply to her emails anymore, and I didn't feel the need to. But something shifted in me. I didn't forgive her entirely, but I let go of the anger. I realized it wasn't about her anymore, it was about me. Holding on to bitterness only gave her power over me, and I was done letting her take anything more. I took a deep breath and deleted the email. It was a small action, but it felt monumental. A new life. By the 3rd anniversary of my divorce, my life had found a rhythm I never could have imagined during those dark days. Truth and Trust had expanded across several states, providing legal aid, therapy, and community support to hundreds of men. Emily was thriving in college, balancing her studies with a part-time job, and she called me regularly to share her latest stories. As for Anna, well, we were taking things slow, but every step felt right. One evening, I stood on the stage at a Truth and Trust gala, looking out at the crowd. The room was filled with men who had come through our program, their families, and even a few journalists covering the event. As I spoke about the Foundation's mission, I felt a profound sense of purpose. "We all face moments that test us," I said, my voice steady. "Moments that threaten to break us. But those moments don't define us. What defines us is how we choose to move forward, how we rebuild, stronger and wiser than before." The applause was thunderous, but what stayed with me was the quiet pride that filled my chest. I wasn't just surviving anymore, I was thriving. And for the first time in years, I felt a deep and lasting peace.